Good morning, everybody. And what you're looking at right here isn't a strike clip this time. It's satellite imagery of a tiny 7 square mile speck of land sitting off Iran's coast called Kharg Island. And that little island right there might be the single most important piece of real estate in this entire war right now. Because overnight, CENTCOM launched its 13th consecutive night of strikes on Iran. At least 4 people were killed, according to Iranian state media. And President Trump came out and said the quiet part out loud, telling reporters that Iran needs, in his words, more of the same. But underneath all of that, the real story breaking today is that the White House is actively weighing sending American ground troops onto Iranian soil, specifically to seize Kharg Island. And Iran's response to that has been to publicly say they welcome it. So today we're going to break down exactly what a ground operation like this would actually look like. Why Kharg Island specifically is the target everybody's fixated on. What Iran is saying back. And whether that welcome mat they're rolling out is real confidence or something that looks a whole lot more like panic dressed up as bravado. So let's set the stage, because 13 nights of continuous strikes is not a small thing. This dynamic really kicked off after the Memorandum of Understanding that was supposed to end. This whole thing fell apart earlier in July. And once that happened, night after night of American strikes started rolling through Iran with a consistency we haven't really seen before in this conflict. Thursday's wave alone hit multiple locations across the country. And CNN has been tracking this as basically the closest thing to a sustained daily air campaign that this war has produced. Trump signaled Thursday that a ceasefire is not on the immediate horizon, saying flatly that Iran needs more of the same, which tells you everything about where his head is right now heading into the weekend. At the same time, drones have been targeting a city in northern Iraq where American forces are based, sirens have been sounding across Bahrain, and Bahrain's own interior ministry has been urging residents there to seek safety in real time. The UK Foreign Office has now issued formal travel guidance advising against all but essential travel to both Kuwait and Bahrain, which is diplomatic language for this region, is genuinely dangerous right now. Don't go there unless you have to. And here's where it gets serious for American forces specifically. At least 4 U.S. service members have been killed in the most recent wave of Iranian attacks over the past week alone, 3 of them in Jordan, and 1 during a controlled detonation of an Iranian drone in Iraq. That's not an abstract number. That's real American families getting real knocks on the door, and it's the backdrop against which this entire ground invasion conversation is happening. Because when you start losing troops on defense, at some point the political and military pressure builds toward doing something more decisive than just absorbing hits and striking back from the air. That's exactly the pressure point we're at right now. It's also worth remembering just how far this specific war has already traveled to get here. This entire conflict traces back to major combat operations that were first announced in late February, with joint American and Israeli strikes hitting military, government, and infrastructure targets across Iran in one coordinated opening move. That gave way to negotiations in June, both sides eventually signing a memorandum of understanding that was supposed to be the actual roadmap out of this thing, built heavily around guaranteeing safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz. For a stretch there, it looked like it might actually hold. And then, like every previous attempt at an off-ramp in this war, it didn't. Both sides accused each other of violating the spirit of that agreement. Strikes resumed, and here we are 13 nights later with the conversation no longer about coastal radar sites, but about American troops physically going ashore on Iranian territory. Every time this war has restarted after a pause, the target list and the stakes have both ratcheted up a notch, and a ground invasion of Kharg Island would be the single biggest notch yet. So let's talk about Kharg Island itself, because if you don't understand why this specific island matters, none of the rest of this makes sense. Kharg Island sits somewhere between 15 and 20 miles off Iran's coast. It's tiny, only about 7 square miles, and it's roughly 350 miles from the Strait of Hormuz itself. But that little island processes something like 90% of Iran's entire crude oil export capacity. 90%. That's not a military target. In the traditional sense, that's the economic jugular vein of the entire Iranian regime. Trump has actually referenced this exact island, going all the way back to a comment he made in the 1980s, where he said publicly that he would seize Kharg Island if Iran ever targeted American troops, and he resurfaced that old quote himself on social media just weeks ago. When Fox's Trey Yingst asked him directly whether he'd order a ground invasion to take the island now that the ceasefire has collapsed, Trump gave one of the more revealing answers of this entire war, saying he couldn't tell reporters his plans because that would be foolish. But adding that, if Iran gets degraded far enough and deep enough, he would absolutely do it. And it's not just talk floating around Truth Social either. According to multiple reports, the White House held a Situation Room meeting specifically to discuss seizing Kharg Island and other territory along the Strait of Hormuz using American troops. Senior administration officials have told reporters that Trump wants Hormuz open, and if that means taking Kharg Island to make that happen, that's going to happen. Though officials are careful to say no final decision has been made yet. The Pentagon has already sped up the deployment of thousands of additional Marines and sailors into the region on top of what's already there, with reports suggesting the administration is weighing sending up to 10,000 more troops. The USS Tripoli, an amphibious assault ship carrying roughly 3,500 sailors and Marines, has already arrived in theater, and that's exactly the kind of platform you'd use to actually put boots on a beach if the order ever came down. It's worth pointing out, too, that American forces have already struck Kharg Island itself earlier in this war, hitting military targets there while deliberately leaving the oil processing infrastructure untouched, a decision Trump has publicly acknowledged making himself. That's a meaningful detail because it tells you the administration has already drawn a distinction between degrading Iran's ability to defend the island militarily and actually destroying the economic asset that makes the island worth taking in the first place. You don't leave 90% of a country's oil export capacity standing on purpose unless part of you is already thinking about who gets to control it later, rather than just blowing it off the map. That's a very different posture than the bridges and power plants conversation we broke down last time, where the goal was pure degradation. Here, the goal increasingly looks like seizure and control, which is a much bigger strategic swing than anything we've discussed on this channel so far this year. Now, here's where the retired brass has been weighing in, and it's worth walking through because this is where the actual tactical picture starts to take shape. Retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, who served as Trump's special envoy for Ukraine until earlier this year and previously commanded the 82nd Airborne Division, has been out publicly making the case for exactly this kind of operation. He said he's a big believer in putting boots on the ground, not necessarily deep into mainland Iran itself, but specifically to take Kharg Island and secure the Strait of Hormuz. His framing was almost historical, saying we kind of need to do it the way the Romans used to do it, put your legions on the ground to secure the territory and give everybody confidence that it can actually be held. He specifically floated using the 82nd Airborne, or Army Rangers, to take the island itself, paired with Marine amphibious ready groups opening up the lower half of the strait to get shipping moving again. That's a two-part operation in his mind, not just reopening the waterway with naval and air assets, but physically controlling the source of Iran's oil revenue on the ground, so Tehran can't just wait out the blockade. But let's be honest about the risk side of this too, because not everyone thinks this is a clean operation. Michael Eisenstadt, a former military analyst who now runs the Military and Security Studies program at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, has warned that an operation like this could produce potentially much larger numbers of American casualties than anything we've seen in this war so far, precisely because it's such a small, exposed piece of terrain sitting right off the Iranian coast, well within range of everything Iran still has left. And Iran still has a lot left on paper. The International Institute for Strategic Studies estimates Iran fields something like 570,000 active duty troops and another 350,000 reserves, backed up by coastal missile batteries, naval mines, and swarms of fast attack boats designed specifically to swarm and overwhelm exactly the kind of amphibious task force you'd need to actually seize an island like Kharg. So this isn't a walk-in-the-park scenario, no matter how it gets framed politically. That's exactly why, according to multiple reporting threads, deployment of ground forces anywhere in Iran is not considered imminent, even as the option stays firmly on the table. And I want to be fair to the other side of this argument too, because Trump himself was singing a completely different tune earlier this year. Back in March, he flatly told reporters that sending ground troops into Iran would be a waste of time, saying Iran had already lost their navy and lost everything else they could lose, and dismissing Iran's own foreign minister's warning about a ground invasion as a wasted comment. That's a pretty significant reversal from where the conversation sits today, and it tells you how much the calculus has shifted as American casualties have mounted and the strait has stayed contested despite months of pure air and naval pressure. When the purely aerial approach stops producing the results you want fast enough, that's usually the exact moment ground options that were dismissed as a waste of time start getting a second look in the Situation Room. That shift in Trump's own language, from waste of time to if we degrade them far enough, I would do that, might be the single clearest signal in this entire story about where things are actually headed. Which brings us to how Iran is actually responding to all of this, and this is where the panic question really comes into focus. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson Esmail Baghaei said publicly that the country's leadership is, in his words, counting down the minutes to welcome American forces in any ground invasion. A regime-aligned academic named Sayed Mohammad Marandi went even further on air, claiming Tehran has spent decades preparing for and actually welcoming a ground invasion, boasting that the Revolutionary Guard introduced a brand new missile to the fight, and claiming Iran has spent years decentralizing and burying its arsenal specifically to withstand a sustained American air campaign. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that Iran has the advantage because it's been accumulating missiles and drones for decades and is still doing so even now, and that the Iranians are hitting very hard and are prepared for a land war because they've been preparing for decades. Now, here's my honest read on that as someone who's actually studied how militaries talk when they're confident versus when they're covering. When a country is genuinely confident in its ability to grind out a ground war, you don't usually see the foreign ministry spokesperson going out of his way to use language like counting down the minutes to welcome the invasion. That's not deterrence, that's theater, and it's theater aimed just as much at Iran's own population as it is at Washington. Compare that to what Iran's chief negotiator Araghchi actually said this week, calling continued American pressure mindless aggression that won't help reach a deal. That's a very different tone than welcome, come on in. One is bravado for the cameras, the other is a government that clearly still wants a negotiated off-ramp and is trying to shame Washington into taking one. You don't get to have it both ways. Either you're counting down the minutes to welcome an invasion, or you're begging the other side to stop, because continued strikes won't get you a deal. Iran's rhetoric machine is running both messages at the same time this week, and that tells me a lot more about internal panic than it does about actual military confidence. Think about it from the regime's actual position for a second, stripped of all the messaging. Every single night for the past 13 nights, American strikes have been chipping away at exactly the capabilities you would need to actually make a ground invasion costly: the coastal radar, the missile batteries, the fast attack boats. Every night that continues without Iran being able to meaningfully stop it is a night where the eventual price of taking Kharg Island, if it ever comes to that, gets a little cheaper for the United States and a little more expensive for Iran to prevent. A regime that actually believed it held the upper hand militarily would not need to publicly announce it, welcomes an invasion, because a confident military does not need to advertise its confidence. The deterrence speaks for itself through capability, not through a press conference. The fact that Iranian officials feel the need to keep saying it out loud over and over, in interview after interview, tells me this is much closer to whistling past a graveyard than it is to genuine strategic calm. And when you pair that rhetoric with a regime academic bragging about a single new missile introduced overnight, as if one new weapon system is the thing that tips the balance after 13 nights of sustained American degradation, that's not the sound of a government holding all the cards. That's the sound of a government trying to manufacture a headline before the news cycle moves past them entirely. Let's talk a little about how an operation like this would actually be executed, because there's a real targeting and sequencing logic here, just like there is with any air campaign, except now we're talking about people physically going ashore instead of ordnance falling from 30,000 feet. If this ever actually happens, you'd expect to see it unfold in phases. Phase 1 would be continued suppression from the air and sea, exactly what we've already been watching for 13 straight nights, hammering coastal radar, missile batteries, and fast attack boat pens, specifically around the island and the wider strait, to shrink the threat envelope before anybody gets close. Phase 2 would be naval mine countermeasures, because Iran has spent years seeding these waters with naval mines specifically to make any amphibious approach costly, and you cannot put Marines ashore until you've swept a lane clean. Phase 3 is where the amphibious-ready groups actually come into play, using something like the USS AAA as a launch platform for Marine expeditionary units, moving in by landing craft and helicopter simultaneously to seize key points on the island fast, before Iranian coastal defense units have time to reposition and mass fires on the beachhead. And if Kellogg's proposal is the model being used, you'd also expect airborne insertion, either the 82nd Airborne or Army Rangers dropping in or air assaulting onto key terrain to secure the oil infrastructure itself before it can be sabotaged. Because the entire point of taking Kharg Island is denying Iran that 90% of its export revenue, not leveling it. So you need people on the ground fast enough to stop demolition charges from going off before you even get there. That's also exactly why this is such a genuinely dangerous mission profile compared to everything else we've covered in this war so far. Every previous strike package we've talked about involves American aircraft going in, dropping ordnance, and getting out, minimizing exposure time over the target. A ground seizure of an island is the opposite of that. It's American troops sitting in a fixed, exposed position for an extended period of time, while Iran's remaining coastal missile batteries, drone units, and fast attack boats try to mass everything they've got left against that one physical location. That's precisely the scenario Eisenstadt was warning about, and it's precisely why, even with all this planning reportedly happening at the highest levels, nobody serious is calling this a done deal yet. Let me also walk you through the timing question, because this matters more than people realize. Any operation like this lives or dies on the window between when suppression is judged good enough and when Iran manages to reposition whatever mobile assets it still has left. Iran has had years now to study exactly how American forces approach amphibious operations, and mobile coastal defense units are specifically built to hide, displace, and reappear somewhere else before a strike package can find them twice. That means the suppression phase can never really be called complete. It can only be called good enough for now, and good enough for now is a much scarier standard to bet American lives on than fully suppressed. This is also why you hear serious planners talk about compressing the actual assault window as tightly as possible, get suppression to an acceptable level, then move fast, land, secure the objective, and consolidate before Iran's surviving batteries can mass fires on a target that isn't moving anymore. The entire risk profile of this operation comes down to how much time elapses between the last airstrike and the first boots hitting sand, and every hour that gap stays open is an hour Iran's remaining coastal units get to reposition. There's also the mine question, which almost never gets enough attention in these conversations, but genuinely could be the single biggest obstacle of all. Naval mines are cheap, they're dumb, they don't need a radar signature to find, and they sit there patiently until something with a hull passes over them. Sweeping a lane clean enough for an amphibious ready group to safely approach a beach takes specialized mine countermeasure vessels, divers, and unmanned underwater systems working methodically over days, not hours, and Iran has had years to seed these waters. That single requirement alone, more than anything happening in the sky, is probably the biggest variable standing between this staying a Situation Room conversation and this becoming an actual order given to Marines standing by on ships already sitting in theater. Let's take a quick break, because I want to tell you about something I've put a lot of work into. I've spent years flying combat missions and studying exactly this kind of decision-making under pressure. When do you commit forces? When do you hold back? How do you weigh a high-value objective against the casualties it might cost you to take it? I wrote all of that down in a book that applies those same military decision frameworks to leadership, to business, and to your own life. Because the same principles that decide whether you send Marines onto a beach are the same principles that decide whether you take a big swing in your career or hold your position and wait for a better opening. You can find the pre-order link down in the description, and if you grab it now, you can still get a signed copy while they last. I really appreciate everyone who's already picked one up. And for anyone pulling long hours right now following this conflict, or just grinding through your own day, I also want to mention the energy drink I've been building, made specifically to avoid that crash. You get about 30 minutes after a normal energy drink kicks in. Natural caffeine, some nootropics thrown in for focus, none of the junk ingredients that leave you feeling worse than before you drank it. It's in production now, so if you sign up through the link in the description, you'll be the first to know when it ships. Plus, you'll get a weekly rundown of everything happening in this war, so you never miss a beat. All right, let's get into the global roundup, because there's a lot happening around the edges of this story that you need to hear. First, Erbil Airport up in northern Iraq had to shut down temporarily after a drone crashed near the facility following a broader drone attack on the city, and it's since reopened. But that's another data point showing how this conflict keeps bleeding outward into neighboring countries that never asked to be part of it. Second, Iran's army has claimed it struck Al Azraq Air Base in Jordan again, the same facility that's hosted American F-35 squadrons and taken missile fire earlier in this war, which tells you Jordan remains one of the single most contested pieces of real estate in this entire fight, even though it's not even the country actually at war. Third, Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been out publicly accusing Iran of using the Strait of Hormuz purely as leverage, calling on other countries to step up and protect global shipping themselves, while also saying the United States remains open to a diplomatic solution if Iran wants one. And fourth, keep an eye on oil markets over the next few days, because every time this conflict escalates toward the words ground invasion, you tend to see crude prices jump on the headline, "Risk alone," even before a single Marine sets foot on anything, simply because markets hate uncertainty around a choke point that handles this much of the world's daily oil flow. And fifth, watch how the Gulf states themselves are reacting to all of this, because Kuwait and Bahrain are absorbing sirens and intercepted missiles for a fight that is not technically theirs, and the longer that continues, the more pressure builds on Washington from its own regional partners to either finish this quickly through decisive action or find some other way to get the strait genuinely stabilized before one of these smaller Gulf nations decides it needs to take independent action of its own to protect its own airspace and its own economy. Now, let's get into the 40,000-foot strategic analysis, because I think this is genuinely one of the most important moments in the entire war so far. For months, every single strike package we've talked about on this channel has been reversible in a sense. You hit a radar site, Iran rebuilds part of it. You hit a bridge, they reroute traffic. You hit a bunker, they dig a new one somewhere else. A ground seizure of Kharg Island is different in kind, not just in degree. If American troops physically take that island and hold it, Iran loses direct control over 90% of its oil export revenue in real time. Not just temporarily disrupted revenue from a strike, but actual physical loss of the terminal itself sitting under foreign military control. That is the single most economically devastating thing that could happen to this regime, short of full regime collapse. And Tehran knows it. which is exactly why you're seeing this split-screen rhetoric out of Iranian officials this week. One voice publicly welcoming an invasion for the cameras, while another voice is out there calling continued pressure, mindless aggression, and practically begging for a negotiated exit instead. Here's the piece that I think most other channels are missing entirely. Kellogg's proposal specifically avoids sending troops deep into mainland Iran, and that's not an accident, that's a very deliberate strategic choice. Taking an isolated island terminal is a contained, definable objective with a clear endpoint. Seize it, hold it, use it as leverage. Marching troops into the Iranian mainland is an entirely different animal, one that every serious military planner in Washington has been trying to avoid for the entire length of this conflict. Because that's the scenario that turns into an open-ended occupation with exactly the kind of grinding, decades-long insurgency risk that America has learned the hard way it wants no part of. So when you hear the phrase ground invasion getting thrown around in headlines this week, don't picture armored columns rolling toward Tehran. Picture a much narrower, much more surgical operation aimed at one island and one economic choke point, executed by Marines and possibly airborne forces, designed to be over in days rather than years. That's the actual scenario being discussed at the highest levels right now, and it's both less dramatic and, in a strange way, more genuinely threatening to the regime than anything we've seen so far, because it takes direct aim at the one thing keeping Iran's economy breathing at all. So where does this actually go from here? My honest assessment is that the air campaign keeps grinding forward exactly as it has for the past 13 nights, continuing to degrade coastal defenses, missile batteries, and fast attack boat capabilities specifically in the waters around Kharg Island, because that's the necessary precondition before anyone seriously considers putting Marines ashore there. If Iran keeps losing service members and equipment at the current pace while its own retaliatory strikes on Jordan, Kuwait, and Bahrain keep producing American and Allied casualties, the political pressure inside Washington to finally pull the trigger on some version of the Kellogg plan only grows. But if Iran's public welcome the invasion rhetoric is actually genuine confidence rather than bravado, and their coastal defenses and mine belts are still intact enough to make an amphibious assault genuinely costly, then this stays exactly where it's been sitting for months, a threat that gets floated, gets planned for in the Situation Room, and gets held in reserve as leverage rather than actually executed. There's also a domestic political layer sitting underneath all of this that shouldn't get ignored either. Rising energy costs tied to this conflict have already become a real political liability heading into the midterms, with control of Congress hanging in the balance and gas prices being one of the most visible things any voter feels every single week, regardless of how they feel about foreign policy in the abstract. That gives Washington a genuine incentive to resolve the Strait question decisively rather than let it drag on indefinitely, because an open-ended blockade with no clear endpoint is arguably worse for domestic politics than a short, sharp, clearly bounded operation with a defined objective and a defined exit. That's part of why the Kharg Island option, narrow, contained, economically decisive, keeps resurfacing again and again in these conversations instead of getting dismissed outright, the way a full-scale invasion of the mainland already has been by nearly everyone involved. One last thing worth sitting with before we close this one out. Every major escalation this war has produced, the first joint strikes back in February. The ceasefire that collapsed in the spring, the reimposed blockade, the bridges and power plants threats, has followed the exact same rhythm. A threat gets floated publicly, gets denied as imminent by officials speaking on background, and then either gets quietly walked back or eventually gets carried out weeks later once the groundwork has been laid. If that pattern holds here, then what we're watching right now with Kharg Island is not a bluff, and it's not a done deal either. It's the exact middle stage where the option gets seeded in the public conversation so that if it does eventually happen, nobody can claim they didn't see it coming. Well, that's usually how these things go in this specific conflict. And there's no reason to think Kharg Island is going to be the exception to a pattern that's held for 5 straight months now. What do you think happens next? Do you think we actually see American boots hit that beach on Kharg Island in the coming weeks? Or do you think this stays exactly where every other red line in this war has stayed, threatened loudly and never quite crossed? Let me know what you think down in the comments. I read every single one. And I love seeing where you all think this is headed. Some of you have been right about where this war was heading before the mainstream coverage caught up. And I'd genuinely love to hear your read on whether Kharg Island actually gets taken, or whether this stays a Situation Room conversation for another few months. If you want the deeper breakdown on how decisions like this actually get made under pressure, grab the book using the link in the description. And if you want to stay ahead of every twist in this war as it happens, get on that email list using the other link below. It's completely free and you will not miss a single development. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. Stay safe out there, and I will see you in the next one. There's a lot more coming on this story in the days ahead, and I'll be right here breaking it down the moment it moves.